So, hey everyone, I'm recording in a slightly different part of my kitchen today than usual. I've got the window on my right-hand side, so the light's coming in from that side. Hope it's not too distracting for this video. It's really cold here in Ireland at the moment, um, but I'm trying to stay cozy. I quite like the winter, actually. It's sort of kind of a bit romantic, I think. Um, anyway, so what I wanted to talk about today was Allison Mack's interview that she recently did with Campside Media, which is the same media company that did a podcast series called Escaping NXIVM, which I highly recommend. It's really, really great. A journalist from Campside Media was also one of the few journalists that was actually granted access to the inner circle of NXIVM whilst NXIVM was still going. And during those years when they were under a lot of pressure and fire in the media, it was just before Keith Raniere got arrested. This journalist was allowed in and did interviews with Claire Bronfman and Keith Raniere and Allison Mack. It was really, really interesting. And that podcast series is still available to listen to as well. But anyway, this same company has just recently released a series of podcast episodes where they interview Allison Mack mostly, but it also includes segments with an interview they did with Lauren Salzman. So very, very interesting, particularly because they are the only media company the only media outlet that Allison Mack has actually agreed to be interviewed by. Apparently, as you can imagine, she has received lots and lots of offers to do interviews. She's been out of prison for, 6 months, I think, and received a lot of offers to do media interviews, but this is the only one that she accepted. I originally was going to do like a reaction style video, commenting on one or two of the episodes, which I thought were particularly interesting, but I'm not going to do that. The podcast is just extreme. It's very long, and there's just so much information and detail packed in there that I don't know if I could do it justice. I think it would just be too massive an undertaking to try to react to an entire episode, because it's just a really excellent podcast, and I encourage you all to go and listen to it. It's 7 episodes in total, and I have to say it provides a lot of insight into who Allison Mack is as a person, how and why she got involved with NXIVM, how she got sucked in so deeply, and how she has begun her deconstruction process, how her healing process is going. Because as you can imagine, that is a lot to recover from. If you know the extent of her involvement with NXIVM, with Keith Raniere, with DOS, it is just horrifying. And I can't even imagine what it must be like to come out of that and to begin to rebuild her life. She has renounced Keith Raniere, which is obviously very nice to see. It's a huge relief that she's not still loyal to him. She is very well aware that she was involved in a cult, and she seems to be on a very good path to gaining awareness of how exactly she was roped into this extremely harmful group. And as you listen to the podcast, the question is raised again and again, and it's kind of left to the listener to grapple with for themselves. Is Allison Mack a victim or a perpetrator? How should we see her as a society? Now, I think this very much depends on your interpretation of the facts. It very much depends on your interpretation of what constitutes a victim and what constitutes a perpetrator, and your ideas about responsibility and coercion and all that kind of thing. My own opinion is that Allison Mack is both. And I think that that is probably the conclusion that most people will come to. She is both a victim and a perpetrator. And as she tells her story, you can see very clearly how she started off as a victim. She was in a very vulnerable time in her life, which is the case with most people who get recruited into a cult. They start off as having a rather large need, an emptiness in themselves that they are trying to fill. And the cult, of course, comes along and is able to present itself as a solution of some kind. And the thing is, human beings are far more susceptible to manipulation than we would like to think, than we'd like to believe we are. But every one of us, myself included, every single person is susceptible to manipulation. And when you're in a vulnerable state, when your defenses are down because you are in pain, or you're grappling with very difficult feelings, or you're trying to resolve trauma, and you're looking for a new direction in which to take your life, you are even more susceptible to manipulation. So that's why I think it's so important both to be cognizant of our levels of strength and resilience at any given time in our lives. Like how are we doing with our well-being at any point in time? Like I think we should have our finger on the pulse of that all the time. We should be able to be aware. Oh, it's getting rather bright. Let me just pull down these blinds a bit so that I'm not blindingly white. So it's so important both to be aware of how strong and resilient we are at any given time, because that is going to change throughout our lives. We're all going to go through periods of ups and downs. So being aware of that, and being aware that we are more susceptible to particularly manipulation, but all kinds of things. We're susceptible to a lot of things when we're in a vulnerable state, and when we're not quite ourselves, or we're not quite at our optimum level of physical and emotional and mental health. So it's very important to be aware of that, but also so important to be educated on manipulation techniques and strategies so that we can start to recognize them when we come across them, and to be aware of how those techniques and strategies influence us, like to be aware of what's going on inside us, to know, hang on, am I potentially being manipulated? Am I being played? Am I being pulled to do things that maybe I wouldn't ordinarily do? Very aware of that, it's very important to be aware of asking ourselves these questions. And it's all about awareness of ourselves, in my opinion, awareness of ourselves and of how we interact with the world around us. So it becomes very obvious listening to the podcast that Allison was in a very vulnerable state. She was in an abusive relationship, very abusive relationship, and she had been struggling with her self-esteem for a long time. It also comes out during the podcast that she was a victim of some kind of trauma and abuse growing up as a child. They don't tell us exactly what it is. Allison has requested that it not be, disclosed, which is fair enough. And then, of course, we have the fact that she was a child actress. She was in performing in front of an audience from the time she was, I think, 4 years old. And she talks about how she had this desperate need to be liked, to please others, to give people what they wanted. It becomes very clear that she has this great need for affirmation and validation. And I spoke about this in one of the videos that I did where I was commenting on an interview that she did with Keith Raniere. I commented on how Allison, to me, comes across as someone who just has this insatiable need to be liked and approved of and validated by others. And she talks about this in the podcast. So there were all these factors in her life that primed her as almost like a perfect target to be recruited into a cult like NXIVM that promised so many of the things that she was looking for. The podcast talks about celebrities as well, and how because they're so surrounded by superficiality in the line of work that they do, so much of it is about image and things that aren't necessarily all that meaningful or deep. A lot of them get propelled on these spiritual quests where they are looking for things to give their life meaning. And so, in many ways, celebrities are prime targets for cults like Scientology, NXIVM, those sorts of things that kind of promise a way to get spiritual enlightenment and personal development and like a deeper meaning in life, in a way that almost seems quite kind of glitzy and glamorous at first, and then later on they realize what they've got themselves into. Now it seems a little bit too dark. That's better. The ever-changing weather and light conditions in Ireland. So Allison Mack very clearly starts off getting involved with NXIVM from a place of vulnerability, from a place of really wanting to do good. And it becomes apparent as she tells her story that Keith Raniere manipulates these things and uses them against her. That becomes very, very obvious. He uses her need for validation and approval to undermine her sense of self. Someone who is always looking to be approved of and validated is starting from a place of not feeling enough, not feeling good enough, not feeling as if they are okay just as they are. And unfortunately, someone who has that shaky sense of self is an absolute prime target for someone like Keith Raniere to come in and exploit that and confirm their fear that they are not loved and not worthy. And it's very clear that that happened with Allison Mack. It also becomes apparent as the podcast goes on and the interview with Allison progresses that a lot of what she did, she genuinely believed was helping to push people to be their best selves and was kind of helping people in their personal development. Now, that does not absolve her of responsibility at all. And to find out how Allison was drawn into these various awful, horrific crimes that she committed, for which she was eventually convicted and imprisoned, go and listen to the podcast. But it is just so interesting to listen to her explain it, how much of her reasons really were altruistic and how much of it also was coming from these kind of deep insecurities and vulnerabilities that she had within herself. Now, does that absolve her of accountability? Absolutely not. And I was very, very happy to see that not only was the interviewer not coming from a place of trying to absolve Allison, in fact, the interviewer was initially reluctant to interview Allison because she didn't want to be like a participant in any sort of redemption arc for Allison. And I thought that was great. So the interviewer already came in with sort of quite a skeptical mindset. And Allison herself goes to great lengths to take accountability for what she's done and to express how horrified she is at herself. And like she doesn't shy away from taking responsibility at all. And that was something which was very kind of noticeable and remarkable to me as, as I listened to the podcast. And I did try to sort of play devil's advocate and think, okay, there are going to be people who listen to this and who know what Allison has done, what Allison was guilty of in NXIVM, how she encouraged women to starve themselves and how she participated in the torture in DOS and, the verbal and emotional abuse and the manipulation that she participated in and all the harm that she caused. There are going to be people who know about all of that and who are perhaps going to be very reluctant to accept any sort of accountability from Allison and to maybe think that, well, Allison's just manipulating people again, trying to kind of control the narrative by coming across as if she is remorseful. And all I can say to that is, I think listen to the podcast and make your own mind up as to what you think the truth is. But what I do want to say, and I suppose the main point of this video, because what interests me is the fact that Allison is willing to express remorse and the fact that she is willing to verbally take accountability. I mean, she has served her time in prison as well. She didn't shy away from that. She knew she was going to prison, and she at no point does she imply that she shouldn't have gone to prison. She embraces that punishment. And I think the fact that we have someone who is willing to verbally take accountability and is willing to try to make amends and at least start on the path to redemption, I think is extraordinary. And I think it's an extraordinarily positive thing. And I'm very interested in the process whereby someone goes from a perpetrator, like a victim, to a perpetrator, to then someone who wants to make amends. And I think whatever you believe about Allison's true motives, it is positive that she is openly and publicly acknowledging her wrongdoing and engaging in steps that certainly to me look like self-awareness and self-education and taking responsibility and trying to contend with the person that she was in NXIVM and the person that she wants to be going forward. It's so interesting because her current partner is someone who actually used to be a neo-Nazi. It's just fascinating. He used to be a skinhead, like a white supremacist, and he is reformed. And he now is a motivational speaker. He talks about his time being involved in like skinhead gangs and how he had this like awakening about the people that he had been groomed to hate and how he had an awareness of them as human beings and how that kind of jump-started his de-radicalization. It's a very, very interesting story. And he and Allison meet, and it's so interesting because she says to him, he didn't know who she was at first, and then he looked it up and then found out about everything that she'd done. And she says to him, do you judge me? And he said, well, who am I to judge? I like kidnapped and people and beat them up, and I was this awful racist person, who held these absolutely hateful beliefs. Who am I to judge you? And I just thought, this is an incredible story of redemption for both these people, and how via their recovery from these extremist beliefs, Allison in NXIVM and him in the white supremacist group that he was a part of, and how they've become de-radicalized and paid their dues to society, or they're trying to pay their dues, and they're reforming their beliefs, and they found this love and relationship with each other where they don't judge one another, because both of them have done horrible things, and both of them are trying to make things right and trying to live a new life. I just think it's a really beautiful way to conceptualize people who have done awful things, and a possible route for redemption, and how when you're talking about evil, when you're talking about evil things that people have done, it's very understandable that we would want to judge. And I think there is a time and a place for judgment. But I also think that there has to be a way for people like this, people like Allison and her partner. His name's Frank. I think it's Frank Meenick is his name. There has to be a way for them to be reformed. And, a lot of the criticism of the system of crime and punishment that we have in the justice system is that it doesn't provide adequate opportunities for criminals to reform and for them to change their ways. And any system of punishment, I believe, and I have believed for a long time, has got to include a way that people can come back and live a good life and be good people. Because as much as human beings are vulnerable and susceptible to being manipulated and being drawn into, violent extremist groups, and being like somehow finding themselves doing really awful, terrible, hateful things, as much as people have that vulnerability to evil, they also have the ability to change. Our brains are malleable and adaptable. And I truly believe every one of us has the capacity to change. And we have that ability to reform those bad parts of ourselves. Now, not everyone is going to take those opportunities. Not everyone is actually going to explore that capacity for change. Unfortunately, some people never feel remorse and never try to change and never try to make amends or try to reflect and learn from the awful things that they've done. But I think where we see glimmers of hope with a person, and someone who is willing to look at what they've done, willing to accept that it was wrong, willing to change, willing to try to make amends, I think we as a society have got to make room for that. And one of the problems that I have with cancel culture, however you define that, is a lot of the time I feel like it doesn't give people room to change and to make amends and to come back and to rejoin society and to regain perhaps a little bit of a reputation and, society's approval back. And in some ways you can understand people who've done really, really awful things are going to face consequences. And part of those consequences are going to be that the people who have been hurt and people who feel for the people who have been hurt and for the victims may never fully trust that person who's done those evil things, may never fully trust them again. And I think that's fair. But I think if we can find it within ourselves to just allow that space for someone to change, I think we should do that. Cautiously, of course. Don't just immediately open up your heart and open up your life to someone who has done really bad things in the past. It's something that has to be earned. And like both Allison and Frank have done time in prison. Both of them have gone through and continue to go through therapy and are doing their own personal development in order to understand what happened, because they do have accountability for their actions. Of course they do. All of us do. Every one of us who has made a bad decision to do something that hurts someone else has to take accountability for that and try to understand what led us to do it. We have to try and make amends as best as we can. And we have to somehow reform ourselves and our behavior to ensure that we don't do that kind of thing going forward. And we also have to accept the consequences that come with those bad actions. Those are all the things that we need to do each time we've hurt someone. And yet, I think there's got to be a place for that change to happen. Like, I do think as a society, we need to allow that change to happen. I learned via listening to that podcast with Allison Mack. She mentioned a docuseries called Why We Hate that I hadn't heard of before. And because she mentioned it on the podcast, I went and downloaded it, and I've been watching it. I'm almost finished with it. It is a fascinating and wonderful documentary series that I highly, highly, highly recommend. I think every human being on the planet should watch it. But it explores the various ways in which people become radicalized to hate and be violent towards others, to hold hateful beliefs, to do bad things towards other people. And they explore a lot of, really extremist groups and beliefs and genocides and things that have happened, and how people were sucked in to these groups and into these beliefs and how they did these awful, awful things. It's just a fascinating documentary because the people who were drawn in they're not psychopaths. They're normal, healthy people who were subject to brainwashing, coercion, manipulation on often over a long period of time. And, we all like to think of ourselves as good people. Like, we look at like the genocide in Rwanda or the Holocaust or, the awful things that happened in communist Russia, or the Soviet Union rather. And we like to think like we would never do that. We would never inflict those sorts of horrors on another person. But we have to contend, if we're going to be truly self-aware, we have to contend with that part of ourselves that is capable of hurting other people, that is capable of extremist beliefs under the right conditions. And this docuseries explores those conditions and what leads seemingly intelligent, normal, good, healthy people to do really, really extremist and awful things to other people. And and Frank actually, Allison's partner, Frank, is actually featured in that docuseries. It's very, very interesting how he explains his process of becoming de-radicalized. There's another very, very interesting person who's featured in the docuseries who used to be an Islamic jihadist, who used to preach jihadi beliefs, like these awful terrorist ideologies, and how he became de-radicalized. His story is very interesting as well. And it's so interesting because there's for me, one of the most powerful scenes in the whole docuseries that so far is this guy, Jesse Morton, who used to be Islamic extremist, like a jihadist. Actually, what he's been de-radicalized, and he's actually sitting across the table talking to Jason Kessler, who is the alt-right white supremacist leader who organized the Unite the Right rally back in 2017. And the two of them are sitting across from one another having a conversation. And they're having like ongoing dialogue with one another, trying to understand. Or, you know, there's like these, and you see these glimmers of hope with Jason Kessler, where, you know, he still holds these awful white supremacist beliefs, but you can kind of see the process of de-radicalization happening slowly. So I just think we have to hold a space for people to change, people who have done awful things to change. Like, yes, they should face punishment, and no, they shouldn't just be accepted with open arms, but there should be a space where they can think about their beliefs and whether these beliefs actually make sense. Because something that Frank says is that he would never have had his mind changed by like people who would throw bottles at him when he was doing his like white pride rallies, and people would like scream at him and shout hateful things at him and throw bottles and like try to be violent towards him, trying to stop him from, you know, expressing his views. That didn't change him. What actually changed him was acts of kindness that he experienced from people whom he had been taught to hate. It's just very, very interesting, and it really got me thinking. You know, it's very thought provoking, and I highly, highly, highly recommend the docu-series if you're interested in these. As I say, I actually think every human being on the planet should watch it. But it raises just very, very interesting questions about Allison and about her possible future for reintegration into society. She talks about wanting to go back to college and, you know, do a degree. And she wanted to do a degree in feminism and gender studies, of all things. And her classmates, when they found out, you know, who she was and what she'd done, they didn't want her in their class anymore. And I had conflicting feelings about that. On the one hand, I understand, you know, someone like Allison who has done these awful things to women particularly, like why other students would feel unsafe to have her in the class and why they wouldn't want her to be part of their discussions. On the other hand, is rejecting Allison and telling her that she can't participate at all, is that the right approach when she is trying to rebuild her life and trying to learn? Like, she's a student in that context. You know, she's not in a position of leadership. I can understand not wanting her to be in a position of leadership until like much further down the road when she's done a lot more work on herself. But should we be excluding her from taking classes like that? I don't think so. I can see both sides of it, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts and opinions about this. These are really, really complex questions and topics that I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts and feelings about. And I didn't want to do like a huge deep dive into all of this, but I just wanted to express some of my thoughts because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few days, ever since I heard the podcast and started watching this documentary, Why We Hate. Please go check out both. They're both really, really thought-provoking and, you know, well worth a watch and a listen. And I will see you next time, guys. As I say, feel free to just drop your thoughts and opinions in the comments, and let's just get some sort of a conversation going about these ideas.